My name is Averil Coxhead. I'm from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. A couple of things you need to know. I talk quickly. I try not to, but it happens, and I'm sorry. Put your hand up if you need me to slow down, or if somebody in the back can start making panic faces or noises, that would be useful too. I've got quite a big topic to cover. Next thing is you can hear my New Zealand accent a little bit, so I'm going to keep talking so that you get used to me. That's important too. There are pictures on the slide because I'm not that good looking, but they are, so you can always take a look at those as well. They're all representative of different parts of New Zealand, and most of them are connected to me in some way. So this is a picture of Mount Taranaki, so this is where I was born here in this place. So I come from a beachside community, but there's a mountain right there as well. So anybody from Japan starts feeling a little bit homesick, I understand. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about vocabulary load and vocabulary size. You might be interested, and you might be wondering why at an extensive reading congress I'm talking about these topics. It's because while I support and encourage extensive reading a great deal, and I'm involved in the Extensive Reading Foundation, I'm getting nervous, somebody's behind me. I've heard stories. I don't actually do research in this area, so I thought I'll just talk to you about the stuff that I do, and hopefully you'll be able to make some connections as well. Little bit of a plug. We have a vocabulary conference coming up at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. You might recognise one or two of the faces. This is Paul and I at a very serious moment. This is my PhD graduation. So if you're interested in coming along, there's the website and those are the dates, just before Christmas. So come and have Christmas in New Zealand.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Does he do those bunny ears to everybody?
You'd need to ask him that question. I'd take it as a sign of respect. Okay, so I organised the talk because that's a polite thing to do. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to be looking at vocabulary loads, this idea of looking at the vocabulary that's in a text and trying to figure out how many words you need to read that text. Paul Nation knows a lot about this because he pioneered the research. I'm going to be looking at testing vocabulary size, and I'm going to give you some reports on vocabulary size testing that we've been doing in New Zealand. Paul talked about it a little bit this morning. And then I'm going to bring in vocabulary size and load and think about reading for English for academic purposes, which is one of my main areas of research. And then some implications for teaching. And if we've got time, some possibilities for future research. Come on in. Nice to see you. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to get you guys to do some work. So here we go. What size vocabulary might you need to read the following texts in English? If you know the answers, just keep a little bit quiet. If you don't know the answers, have a chat to the person next to you. I'm going to give you a minute because I'm that kind of a girl. Away you go. Different kinds of texts. How many words do you need to know to read those texts? That 98%. Go. Have a chat. Quick. Come on. Talking. Have you got somebody to talk to? Atsuka, who are you talking to? You alright? Okay. Hi there. So you girls having a chat, that's good. Have you got somebody to talk to? I didn't think so. You turn around and talk to the person next to you. Can you kids talk to each other? You okay? Yeah. You alright? Yep. Good. Okay. And one more. Keep talking. What about those? It's all hey, you're too smart. You're too smart. No, you're all right. Okay. So, if I say you need around 8,000 to 9,000 words, what kinds of texts would we be talking about from that slide? Newspapers. Yep, bingo. Anything else? Unsimplified text, yep. So we've got the Courier Times, they're in English, right? Those newspapers, that was what my research told me. Pride and Prejudice, I did a little bit of a study. Have you read The Hunger Games or seen the movie of The Hunger Games? Is Is it popular here? There's a big argument in New Zealand secondary schools with teachers because some teachers love this series. It's about teenagers and sex and all kinds of violence. So half the teachers think it's fantastic because students read this literature, right? So if you're interested in reading and you want your students to read, it's great. But if you don't like the fact that it's about sex and violence, then you have a problem as a teacher. And some research that I did a comparison of Pride and Prejudice and The Hunger Games and found it's the same vocabulary load, which of course upsets literature teachers a lot because they consider Pride and Prejudice to be very beautiful, and they immediately said, oh, but the sentences are longer. So, oh yeah, okay, sentences are longer. All right, yeah, Paul.
That's my hometown.
That's right, yeah.
It's just over the front of that other mountain.
See? There you go, it is real. The funny thing is that Paul's hometown is called Ohakune, and my hometown is Opunake. So it's both near mountains. I'm closer to the sea. It's easy to go fishing from his village in rivers and from my village in the sea. Okay, and here we've got TED Talks as well, and university level text. So that's the 8,000 to 9,000. What about more than 9,000? Well, that includes, I'm sad to say, a university level computer science textbook. So there's something in these textbooks that means that they're very technical in the language, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Unfortunately, also a New Zealand secondary school science textbook for 15-year-olds, so the vocabulary level in there is higher than 9,000 families plus proper nouns. I had a text that you use in class. I don't know what text you use in class, but you can find out the vocabulary load if you want to. I also had up there the different graded readers, and the answer, as Aaron pointed out, is it depends, right? It depends on the level of the reader. Okay, so I've got one more question for you guys as well, something more to think about. I'd like you to answer this question. If you have a computer science journal article that was written in the 1950s versus one that was written in the 2000s, what do you think the vocabulary load will be? What's your best guess? In other words, how has the field changed? You have half a minute. Go. You got somebody to talk to? You guys can talk to each other. You all right? You can do your internal dialogue. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Stop enjoying yourselves. Now, do you think this is going to be good news or bad news? Oh no, it's actually really, it's not just bad news, it's really bad news. Okay, 1950s, to reach 79% coverage, you needed 30,000 word families plus proper nouns. What do you reckon, 2000s, up or down from there? 2000, 65% at 30,000 word families plus proper nouns. So this research was done by an MA student of mine, a guy called Paul Radford. And what he did is he gathered three. Numbers are not my strong point. He had materials that teachers, teachers of students who are first year students, what materials they gave to the class, textbooks that they used, and then journal articles. And the higher vocabulary load was these journal articles, and he was interested to see what happens to a field that has changed a lot from when it began through until now. And what he said he saw in the field is this higher level of specialization, so more and more specialized language in there. You might be interested that the vocabulary load of the text that the teachers gave to the students was lower, but it was still much higher than a newspaper or a novel, for example. So this represents a 15% overall drop in coverage. It's quite extraordinary. The articles have doubled in length. They're much longer than they used to be. They use around 25% more word types and a third more word families than they did over that time. So things have changed a lot. And if you were at my session yesterday, what are you doing here today? No, if you're at my session yesterday, you would have heard me talking about the kinds of vocabulary that's found now in computer science, includes words like cloud, and cloud is a highly technical term. Right? So that is an example of a field that's changing. And really what I'm interested in is what's the consequences of this for an EAP teacher who's preparing students to go and study computer science at school. I don't know about you, but my knowledge, 30,000 word families, whew, you'd be stretching it. I could teach the word cloud. I'd be good at that, but the rest of it I'm not so sure. So these are questions. This leads to another question. Now, actually, I need to talk about the photo on the right-hand side. Remember the mountain? That's the one, not Paul's one, my one. We have to make a difference here. You can see it through the sea. So my home that I have now is also on a little beach place. You always go back to where you come from, hey? I can't live all the way near the mountain anymore because it's 4 hours to university and back every day. But I can live where you can see it across the sea. It's a nice thing that can happen sometimes in the morning. And a little kid came in one day to the local shop and said, there's a popsicle in the ocean. Popsicle's like an iced lolly, right? It was the mountain. It's a popsicle in the ocean. Okay, so the question is, the most important thing is, if you need 8,000 to 9,000 word families, then how big is your vocabulary? So this is one of the questions we've been asking with doing vocabulary size test. Now I've got 3 slides coming up. I'm going to show one. I want you to talk about it. Then I'm going to show another one. I want you to talk about it. All right, we're going to do it 3 times, okay? And I'll just change the slide. So keep an eye on it, but keep talking. You ready? This is Bella. She's my dog. In this picture, she was 7 months old, first time in the car, very excited. Now, how many words in English does Bella know? Have a chat. What do you think? Oh, Bella's not very bright. You need to know that as well. Nice but dim. Go, have a chat. What do you reckon? How many words does she know? Okay, new one. New one. What do you think? And here's the next new one. Okay. Now, if you said Bella knows 50 words, you would be completely wrong. But she knows, Bella knows when the fridge opens and the cheese packet comes out, right? So she's not completely dumb. Now, do you think that my vocabulary size is going to be bigger than Joe's vocabulary size, who's 13? Yep, okay. That would be good. So bigger than Bella's vocabulary size. Cheese, yeah. Apart from that. Okay, so there's something happening here with age as well, right? You'd expect people who are older to have a bigger vocabulary than people who are younger. So what we've been doing in New Zealand is using Paul Nation's... Oh, spooky. Okay, so we're looking at testing vocabulary size. And what have we been doing? Using Paul Nation's vocabulary size test. And the original version was up to 14,000 word families. We've increased it up to 20,000, and we've made new parallel versions. That there are the 2 of these versions are available on Paul's website, and the answers are there as well. But don't tell your students that part, okay? It's a 100-item test, so there are 5 items per 1,000 words. So 5 items for the first 1,000, second 1,000. Now, it's not a levels test. We're not testing how many words they know at each level. It's a size test. We want to know overall what's their vocabulary size. There are bilingual versions available, and you might, again, want to take a look online. I've got some references for you to take a look at as well. Okay, the test can take, I've seen fast people do the test in 15 minutes, super quick. Some people take up to half an hour, and other people are even slower. One thing that happens with the test is that you start off really quickly, right? First 1,000 words, sweet. Second 1,000, all good, People chug along quite happily. And by the time you get to about 12,000 words, even native speakers start going, not quite so sure, it's interesting to see what happens when people are taking the test. Okay. I've said already that there are website versions available online, so you could take a look at Paul's website, which is where a lot of useful material is, but also these 2 new versions of the test. There's an adapted online versions as well, and you can find the monolingual and bilingual versions there on my.vocabularysize.com, and then the lexical tutor has it as well. So if you're interested, it's on Tom Cobb's website as well. And here's an example of the vocabulary size test. So there's the word, so you can see that the target word is strap. The pictures down the bottom are not from my village, but they're just to demonstrate the word strap. It's not part of the test, okay? That's not part of the test. It's just a written part of the test. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is show you some slides where we go with examples from each of the 1,000 levels, and I want you to talk to the person next to you and say, oh, okay, so on this slide, what do you reckon? You know, how many of these words do you know? And again, series of 3 slides, and I'll just tell you when I've moved on to the next one. All right? So we'll start with the easy stuff. Have a chat. Go. I'm going to change it in about 30 seconds. What do you see here? Have a chat with the person next to you. What do you reckon? So the easy ones are here, and they go across. Okay? 7,000 to 8,000. Okay. Now I'm going to move to the next lot, right? So it's going to be starting at this end is 9,000 to 10,000, going up to 15 to 16. Now keep talking. What do you reckon? Can you give a meaning? Okay. You right? All right, you ready? Here's the last one. Getting up to 23 to 24. Splunk, did you say? Spelunk, yeah. Okay, here we go. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, I'm not going to ask you to tell me which words you don't know or whatever, but what do you notice about the words as you get lower frequency? What do you notice about the words? Yeah, very special. Yep. They get Latin based, they get longer. Anybody else? And Greek based as well. Yep. As for me, I notice that I get more and more holes in my knowledge as it goes along. This is based on the British National Corpus and COCA corpus as well. So so there are some words where you know them immediately. You don't even know how you know them. But it's interesting that you'll see words and you think, oh, it's quite low frequency word, but I know it. And then there's another one next door and you think, never seen that one before. So over on the far right, I recognise 1 or 2 of those words, but please don't ask me to define what that word is, you know. So the test is a recognition test and it's multiple choice, so there's support for people along with that. It's really interesting when we look at, I've interviewed quite a few native speakers and non-native speakers who have taken the test, and the native speakers often say, oh, this meaning of the word isn't quite what I think it should be, you know. Okay, you know, and some non-native speakers have some really interesting things to say about the test, and I'll give you some examples of that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a quick run through some of the results that we've seen. So I've been testing adults using the vocabulary size test, and in this group, 218 test takers, more girls than boys. Now, one thing I want you to really think about is that the people who came to take this test responded to a poster, and the poster said, how big is your vocabulary? We don't know either. Come and take a test. Okay? Now, who are the people who will come to your office to take a vocabulary size test? People who think that they have a very good vocabulary size. People who think they don't have a big vocabulary size do not come to your office to take a vocabulary size test. Okay? Another thing is, these people all sat the test with a researcher sitting in the room with them. They sat them individually. Right? So they didn't sit them in a big room full of computers. They had somebody in the room with them at all times. And the people who were in the room with the test takers would respond to questions like, can you say this word for me? You know, not give me the answer, but can you just say this word? Because sometimes you can hear a word and think, oh, it's that word, right? One of my nieces, when she was 21, was using the word paradigm. And I said, paradigm, that's an interesting word. Do you mean paradigm? So she'd read the word, but she'd never actually said the word out loud, right? Okay, so overall, what did we get? Overall vocabulary size, remember it's out of 20,000 words, was 13,600. But you need to know the native speaker average was 16,800. This is rough stuff, right? The non-native speaker average was 10,800. But how does that break down? So what we did is, this is me. What I did was, remember I said we got new versions? So there are 6 versions of the test. So all of these zeros, all of this stuff, that's 6 versions of the test. Test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this is just a simple graphic with hokey pokey ice cream, which is very nice from New Zealand, just showing over the 6 tests what happens. Now, the problem with this statistic is that what we need to do is to break it down, because who's a non-native speaker? So we looked again at the data and we said, well, all right, what happens if you say, let's take the Europeans out of this mix? What about them? And this research took place at a university, so you're not talking about a wide cross-section of the university, right? Of the general population. You're saying, come and test your vocabulary size, so I think I've probably got a good vocabulary, and then you get who's working in a university or who's studying at a university. So we're not talking about a wide cross-section of society, okay? Speakers of Asian languages was around 10,000. I thought that was pretty good. And pre-university second language learners, so they're in an English for academic purposes preparation course for studies. Their score was around 8,000 words. And this is the graphic on this. So one of the things to note about the test is that if you're a non-native speaker, Asian speaker of the language, you want to take test 2 because it has a little bit more than the others, right? But actually not much really overall, because the scale on the side tells you that it's only within 4 or 5 or 6. Okay, but roughly the test followed the same sort of a pattern. What happens if you're a man or a woman? I'm going to do this really fast. But there were lots of boys in the study who were second language learners who were in the EAP class, so don't take this too seriously, okay? I don't want to cause a gender war here. In the secondary school study data that Paul and I have been working on, there was no difference, statistically no difference between girls and boys, okay? All right, VST in secondary schools. So this project, Paul talked a little bit about it this morning. We went into secondary schools and we wanted to test people individually and in groups, because if there's a difference in the results between people who take a test individually with a researcher sitting there like the adults did, and the score is different if you sit the test individually to if you sit it in a group, then we've got a problem, right? So that's one of the first things that we were looking at. So in this study we got just under 1,000 secondary school students, and going into schools it was amazing. So the rector that Paul was talking about this morning, the principal of the school, I emailed him and said, we'd really like to come to your school and test, 100 boys. And he emailed me back and he said, I'm not sure I've told you this, Paul. He said, any work involving Paul Nation is fine with me. All of our young men would be delighted to take your vocabulary size test. Really? So we ended up in the whole school. So fantastic. We were interested in vocabulary and reading. So if people are struggling with their reading, is vocabulary the problem or is reading the problem? And we're also interested in this non-native speaker idea. So what happens if you're a non-native speaker? When do you become a native speaker from a vocabulary perspective? So we gathered not just the vocabulary size data, but we also we talked to quite a few of the people, the young men and the young women who took this vocabulary size test as well. We're still looking at the data. And as I said, testing individually and in groups. Okay. So really, so far, we've only looked at the native speakers, as Paul talked about this morning, and what we've found confirms some earlier findings by Paul and some other colleagues who were saying that basically you take the age of the young person, you minus, it's highly scientific this, you minus their current age by 2 or 3 and then times it by 1,000, and that generally fits the pattern of their vocabulary size. Is that all right? So within the data set, 13-year-olds scored around 10,500 words. And it goes up, which is good news as well. It's not as big a jump as I would have thought, but that's interesting as well. But again, the formula holds true, right? Does that make sense? Is that okay? Okay. All right. So we've been analysing the data to see whether there's an order effect if you take the 2 tests. Is it different test 1 to test 2? We've been looking at individual versus group, and we've found some interesting work there, and Paul's finishing up an article that we're looking at there too. Okay, now, one of the things that has become very clear about when people take the vocabulary size test, one of the questions is, often from teachers, do my students have to take the whole test? Can I just, cut it down to 7,000 and give it to them? And the answer is yes, please have them take the whole test, even if you see that their motivation is dropping, which it does. Native speakers who have taken the test have said to me, oh man, I felt really stupid by the end of it. And that's not a good effect for a test, right? But one of the things that came clear in the interviews when I was talking to people was that people know all kinds of things that is quite amazing. So here's some examples. Paul calls this the Slumdog Millionaire effect. In Slumdog Millionaire, you remember there's the film, and the book is called Q&A, where you have the life of this young man he's in a quiz show, and how does he know the answers to the questions? Is he cheating, or has his life experience taught him things? And here's examples of some second language learners talking about what life has taught them in English. So here is TV. This is a word from the 13,000 word level. It's fugue. And he knew it. He got it right. I said, how do you know that? Oh, it's musical stuff. He said, yep, I know. I've had experience of that in my life. That's how I know the answer to that question. Here's somebody else. CW, 19,000 word level, knew the word antimatter. Why? She had read Angels and Demons, which is the book by, what's his name? Yeah, Dan Brown. Okay. So antimatter. Yep.
So just one thing, so you're recommending we give the whole test.
Yeah.
But you can see there's a difference between the ESL students you gave it to and the EFL students we teach. So some of our EFL students are going to gain too much from guessing.
This is an argument to be had about guessing, absolutely, but we do. I think that given you've got that many items in the test, I don't think guessing's going to take you it's not going to completely skew all of your results. So what you're telling me is that if in a foreign language that's going to be a different scenario.
With Germany, in EFL setting, we give the first 8,000.
Right. And what happens to the words that they know beyond the 8,000? That doesn't get counted in.
But at the same time, they're still, even with just the first 8,000, they're getting lots of credit for words that they don't know when you go back and ask them.
Yeah, but that's a different test, hey? If you go back and ask them afterwards, this is an Albert Schmidt argument. So if you go back and ask them afterwards, that's a completely different measure to this receptive test that we're talking about here. So valid point, absolutely, but there are counterpoints to the arguments as well. Okay, and here's the last one. We've got FB, who's an Italian speaker, knew the word thwart. I've never thought that anybody would know the word thwart, but there you go. And she said, yeah, I've had my travel plans thwarted. And you go, oh, okay, all right. Here's one of my favourite comments. This is from a native speaker who said, this feels like things get triggered way down deep in your memory gland. It's like looking for something at the bottom of your handbag. So these lower frequency words, when they're digging down in their memory for what the meaning of this word is, this is a native speaker, she says, you've got a handbag and you're looking around down there, and somewhere down there is the answer, maybe, hopefully. This reminds me of, Janet Ivanovich has a story, a whole series of books, and one of the main characters is a woman called Lula, and Lula has a very big handbag, and at very important parts of the story she has to look for her gun, but she can never find it because it's all down the bottom of the handbag. But anyway, that's what it is for me as well. Okay, so one of the points that I wanted to talk about today was this idea of taking vocabulary size and then taking vocabulary load and saying, can we connect these things up? And we've already had several talks in this conference, which is looking at grading materials. Paul's a good example of that. So I think that we can take this vocabulary size information and this vocabulary load information and say, well, how can we grade our materials? So one thing we can do is test the students to find out their vocabulary load and then make sure that we're trying to hit the spot with their work. And that's the idea behind these mid-frequency readers, for example. We can help choose materials using this kind of a measure and assessing materials for student use. And I think we need to be very careful with it as well, because we can use the VST as a measure before the course begins, but you want to be careful that you're not using it all of the time. I mean, how do you show progression and knowledge? This is a very big measure. It's a bit blunt. It's not precise. You don't get that idea of what the gaps that filled in their knowledge during this time, right? So you could use it once and then maybe, I don't know, a jury's out whether a year later, for example, might be enough. We've got people in New Zealand who are arguing that teachers should be using it more often. I'm a little bit wary about that. The main thing is to check whether or not students are actually, whether they know words that we might be teaching them. And that's, I think, going to be a key point as well. Okay, I've adapted a table here, ways to approach vocabulary for EAP teachers and learners. So this is me talking again about my context, which is ESL in particular. So this is a table that Paul's put together for an article that we've got coming out soon. So the idea is if you've got the different levels here, high frequency, mid and low, you got your word levels there, which he talked about earlier as well. What are the learning procedures? And I've put in here things like TED Talks and mid-frequency learners, but deliberate learning features there as well, because the vocabulary load of TED Talks we know. There are plenty of resources available on the TED Talks website to help teachers and learners use those resources. So you can get transcripts, for example. And if your learners are up to that level, then that's a good way to get into academic listening as well. This subject area, remember that I talked about clouds in computer science. I think that can be quite a level of difficulty. So not every technical word is a really long, difficult word. You know, sometimes they can be quite small. Okay, now, conscious of the time. Okay. With vocabulary size and vocabulary load, I think that there are some challenges, but there are also some opportunities. And one of them, and I'm going to say it again, we might end up teaching students that they already know, they recognise. Maybe they don't use them, but they're in the brain, right? And that's something that we need to be very careful about. And this idea of mid-frequency vocabulary. So how do we keep making sure that we're building on that knowledge of those students? What do we do with specialised vocabulary and vocabulary size? I would really like to see the development of some specialised vocabulary tests so that we can talk with learners before they start a course. So I'm thinking here, if you've got students who are going to study philosophy at university or computer science, then what we do is we try and develop some specialised vocabulary tests so that we can find out what they know before they start and then see and track that knowledge development as they go through. And how are they developing that specialised vocabulary? One of the things that's very clear when students come into our university, for example, is that the students are so busy, second language learners, they're so busy working on their academic studies that they don't have time to keep working, or they don't have time to keep working on their vocabulary learning or their grammar learning. So it's quite ironic because they come into the New Zealand context really excited because they're going to learn and use their English every day and they're going to do all these amazing things, and then they find out they have to read 20 books a week and they've got to drink that much beer and they've got to go to all these classes and then they've got to write assignments, and life gets quite stressful. And what falls away during that time is keeping track of their learning and really making sure that they're trying to keep the principles of learning and learning going as well. They might well be doing lots of learning, but it's not being they're not sitting down and saying, now I'm going to make some word cards to help me with the words that I've learnt this week. They're not doing that. They're trying to just swim. That's all they're doing. They're trying not to drown. Okay. One of the key questions that worries me in the English for academic purposes context is how much reading do students actually do? So it always worries me when I pick up a textbook and there are lots of short texts. I understand why there are lots of short texts in a textbook, but reading at university is not reading lots of short texts, right? They're quite long, they're quite involved. The vocabulary that they have in them is quite varied. How much are students actually doing in there for their studies, but also what are they doing in their spare time and how much reading are they doing in general? We had a young man who sat the vocabulary size test and he was 12 years old and he scored around the same size as an adult native speaker. He's first language speaker of English, and Paul interviewed him and said, how come you're so good? And he said, I read quantum physics in my spare time. Okay, all right, that's good. Carry on. And this is question Stuart's asking, what about production versus reception? So what happens when we go back and if do learners know these words but they're not actually using them? Do they know how to use them? One of the things that I did for my PhD study was looking with what happens when people encounter words in a text. Do they then use them in their writing? And if they don't, what are the factors that impact on them? Why don't they do that? Because I've had years of sitting and teaching staff offices with teachers saying, I've taught them these words and they never use them. Why? And that's what I was particularly interested in there. Okay, so what about future research? We're getting there, folks. Okay, the kakapo yesterday was voted, was voted the second ugliest creature in the world. How can you do that? I think that it's beautiful. Okay. I've talked a little bit about this, but I think it'd be really useful to find out more about the vocabulary load of different subject areas. So we've already had the most depressing news about computer science. I'm not that surprised, but I think that it's really important to find out more about what's happening to our students and the context that they go into. I don't know about your context, but in New Zealand and English for academic purposes classrooms, we don't have full rooms of, classes of 16 students where everybody is going to go and study mechanical engineering and everybody has the same language background. We're more likely to have a PhD candidate in physics sitting from China, sitting next to somebody who's from India, who's going to be studying economics, So how do you deal with, as a teacher, how do you deal with that variety in class? How do you find out about what situation everybody's going into? I've got a PhD student at the moment who's going to be going into classrooms of postgraduate studies at Victoria University to try and find out what happens in peer interaction. So what are the demands of learners in that situation? What do they learn from peer interaction, for example? It'd be really useful to go in and say, what language are you being exposed to and what language are you using, and is there a gap there? And what do we need to do about that as much as anything else? A couple more. I want to look at textbooks for EAP. Already I've been looking at secondary school texts in New Zealand to try and gather a corpus of secondary school texts. I want to find out about vocabulary size and the texts that teachers use in different subject areas. And there's a problem there. And the problem is that in New Zealand, the curriculum is inquiry-based. And what inquiry-based means is that teachers can choose any text. And in some subjects, students can choose any text. So the first question you have to ask is, what texts are students using in the classroom? And when you ask teachers, you get a very different answer than if you talk to librarians and if you talk to the students themselves as well. So the problem with developing a corpus is, how do you find out what people are using, right? I went and talked to quite a few librarians and they said, if you find the answer to the question of what teachers are using, bless you, can you tell us, right? The other thing we've been doing with this particular project is finding out what teachers use online and how they're using those texts as well. And that's a big problem for building a corpus as well. So if this research was not happening in New Zealand, but was happening in a country where you go to university and you start your class and on day one, you open your book, or you go to secondary school, day one, book one, chapter one, page one, go, exercise one, great. That would be fantastic for building a corpus. It'd be very easy, right? And in New Zealand, we like things to be a little bit more difficult, I think, in that way. Okay. Vocabulary load. What about secondary school text vocabulary load? And I'm really interested to know about any more. So you've already met my dog, Bella. And this is Molly. A little bit more. So Molly has a much bigger vocabulary than Bella does, I can tell you that for sure. So thank you very much for being here today. We'll talk about vocabulary size and vocabulary load. I want to know if you've got any questions. We've got a few minutes now. I've deliberately finished a bit earlier. So, over to you. Yeah, Rob.
What are you doing about meaning sensors?
Nothing. But, meaning sensors are hard.
I know.
I saw that you've got work going on with meaning sensors in there. How are you tackling it with your website?
I'm not testing the students by I'm not doing a test. I'm just curious how you do it.
Yeah. So there are lots of principles behind the development of the vocabulary size test and how we've chosen the words that have gone into each of the versions. With the meaning, Paul can correct me on this, but when we developed the other versions, we checked several sources to find out what the core meaning of that word was, and went from that, basically. So what was common across the dictionaries and what therefore we would be tackling. So
vocabulary size quite a lot, and you can probably say an average word has 1.6, 1.8 meanings
Yeah.
or something. So
Yeah.
you can say
Yeah.
20,000 words, well actually,
Yeah.
you're not quite sure what that would be. It's all a bit vague because there's lots of meaning senses we know which one.
But how realistically, how would you then do that?
Well, I think you test an individual meaning. How well do you know the meaning? So you identify how many meaning senses there are.
Yeah.
Given a certain number of word families, let's say you test 20,000 word families.
Yeah.
How many meaning senses does that cover in reasonable sense that might be known by native speakers?
Yeah.
Short data. Then you test that.
Yeah.
And you find out how many of those words.
How big's the test going to be?
Well, I mean, it would come out of the data that you've got.
Yeah. Okay. I'll make a note of that. Yep.
So we can have the results
Hold on.
next weekend if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I get home on Tuesday.
I take the monotemic bias. You
Yeah.
too, Kevin?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Kevin did his PhD thesis on this topic on polysemy. There's the different senses that words have. If we wanted to see, is there some pattern to it? You know, can you see that senses grow in certain ways and so on? There was no pattern. Yeah. And I don't see different senses as being different words.
We distinguish.
I see different meanings as being different words, but meanings are completely unrelated meanings of the word.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so if you, oh, Kevin, can you give me that?
Yeah, Kevin, you give an example.
Well, I promised myself when I wrote my thesis that I would never once use the word bank.
Okay, go on, do it.
I was successful on that. Like cricket, the ball game and the insect. Okay? Just no relationship there.
But different senses would be
Like bridge.
Yep. Card game versus.
Flavor, the flavor of the book,
Mm.
the flavor of the movie, flavor of the moment.
Mm.
Those were, we call those sort of metaphorical senses, because there literally is a metaphor. Right?
Yes,
I mean,
yeah.
people say metaphor when there isn't really a metaphor there. Somebody's really good metaphors. There are some where the meanings were historically related. They just drifted apart so far that they're essentially two different words.
Yeah.
Now.
anyway. That's an argument.
Yeah.
We can have later.
Absolutely. But it depends on how you look at things. If you look at things and say, well, you can't tell me that this word has the same meaning when it's used in different contexts, and how you're therefore going to do that. We haven't been working with that at all.
I would say the sort of definition would be sort of like, do you think it's a different word from other words? Yes, it is. You know, I think, what would a normal average native speaker say? Yes, that's a different meaning set.
Right.
For me,
Okay.
psychologically, what differences will be? Forget what the linguists say. Psychologically.
Get your general usage. Okay. Any other questions?
I mean, it was interesting Paul was talking about the development of mid-frequency graded readers intake streams from Frederica level up to 9,000 word level. I mean, in our context in teaching EAP in University of Nottingham in China, we teach our students streamed and strand. We take 1,500 students in the first year plus pre-master's students, and they get a basic EAP program, but then we teach them ESAP.
Yep.
And I mean, how can we take, like, if we need to produce most of our own resources and textbooks because there aren't any, apart from Garnet, and there aren't enough specific AP textbooks that we can use for our students, how can we, bridge between our general EA program and move into the ESAP element whenever we stream them into computer science?
So that's English for specific academic purposes, right?
Yes,
Yep.
sir.
Yep.
And that's the key area, because like we just said, the load for computer science subject between the first semester of first year and whenever they start their full degree program in the second year at
Yeah.
university.
When do they start reading in their specific subject area in your
They-
studies?
We have to give them a content element during their formative EAP program. So within
Right.
there, they begin to get some. The engineers specifically, more than the social sciences, already get some form of specific academic English for their subject in the first semester. Where the other classes we can hold off because the load for them is actually less. But the engineers is a huge task.
Right.
Especially actually when we receive master's and PhD level students.
Right. Yeah, that's right. So what's your question? How are you going to bridge the gap?
Yeah, I mean, how do we use that kind of information to create our own textbooks? As you said, vocabulary science, vocabulary load, we use it for creating, for grading, or
Yeah.
choosing, or assessing
Yep,
materials.
yep,
The
yep.
materials just don't exist.
Yep. So I would start with the text that these students have to use would be the first point that I would go for, and to say, well, what is it that you have to read in your first year of studying? Because they're studying in your university, hey? So that you're in a beautiful position, because what you're saying is it's all structured, it's all there, and it's in China, so we all know it's day one, book one, class one. Okay, it's good. So what I would be doing is calling on the lecturers from those different subject areas and saying, give me your texts, give me what you're going to use in class. If you can, that would be great. And then do an analysis from there to say what's the vocabulary load of these texts, and then share that information with the students, because I think that's really important. They need to know how many words they need to know. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, to say. So I would make a corpus and say, right, let's do an analysis and say this is where you're reading towards. I'd also say to the students, the only place that you're going to meet these words is in these kinds of texts. So let's get started on that as well. That's another thing I'd be working on. And I'd be looking for ways of grading or simplifying if you needed to. Yeah, we've got 1 minute left. We can talk after this. Yeah, great question. Okay. I'm going to say that that's it because you guys must be tired and it's a hot room. So thanks very much for coming along today, folks. It's been great hearing from you. Okay.
Computer glitch, Makimi Kano, both of whom are at my University of Kyoto Sangyo, then Aaron Campbell, who's at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, Eric Hagley, who is at Muroran Institute of Technology, is that right?